The first snowflake of December landed on my nose with a gentle kiss of winter, its crystalline coldness melting instantly against my warm skin. I stood at the frosted window of our old Victorian house, watching the world transform into a wonderland of white, but my heart felt heavy with an emptiness that seemed to grow larger with each passing day. The familiar scent of pine needles and cinnamon drifted through the house, carried by the warm air from the kitchen where Mom was already preparing for Christmas. But something fundamental was missing from this year's preparations. My older brother Michael wouldn't be coming home for Christmas. The realization hit me again like a cold wave, even though I'd known it for weeks. Michael was 22 now, stationed halfway across the world with the Marines, and his last letter had arrived 3 days ago with the news that leave had been canceled. The paper still smelled faintly of his cologne, that Woody scent he'd worn since high school, and I'd read his words so many times that I could recite them from memory. "Take care of Mom and Dad for me, little brother. Make sure they don't put too much sugar in the eggnog." Even from thousands of miles away, he was still trying to take care of us. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, feeling the condensation from my breath create small circles of fog that obscured my view of the neighborhood. Mrs. Henderson next door was hanging Christmas lights on her porch, their colorful glow reflecting off the fresh snow in tiny rainbows of red, green, and gold. The sound of her humming drifted across the yard, a cheerful melody that seemed to mock the melancholy settling in my chest. Everything looked the same as it had every December for the past 16 years of my life, but without Michael here to share it, the magic felt hollow and incomplete. The hardwood floor creaked behind me as Dad's heavy footsteps approached. I could smell the sawdust that always clung to his work clothes from the furniture shop, mixed with the rich aroma of the coffee he carried in his favorite ceramic mug. He stopped beside me at the window, and I felt the warmth radiating from his body as he placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. His fingers were rough and calloused from years of working with wood, but his touch was infinitely tender. "Penny for your thoughts, son," he said, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly quality that had comforted me through countless childhood worries. Steam rose from his coffee cup, creating little spirals in the cold air near the window. I shrugged, not trusting my voice to remain steady. The lump in my throat felt like a stone I couldn't swallow. Just thinking about Michael. Dad nodded slowly, and I could see his reflection in the window, the lines around his eyes deeper than I remembered, his brown hair showing more gray at the temples. "Me too, kiddo, me too." We stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the snow fall with increasing intensity. Each flake seemed to dance on the wind before settling into the growing blanket that covered our front yard. The old oak tree that Michael and I had climbed countless times stood sentinel in the corner of the property, its bare branches now outlined in white, creating intricate patterns against the gray December sky. "You know," Dad said eventually, taking a slow sip of his coffee, "your brother called this morning while you were still sleeping." My head snapped toward him so quickly that my neck cracked. "He did. What did he say? Is he okay? Did something happen?" Dad chuckled, a warm sound that seemed to chase away some of the chill in my bones. "Easy there, Tiger. He's fine. More than fine, actually. He wanted me to tell you something special." The anticipation built in my chest like a balloon being filled with air. Michael had always been full of surprises, even as kids. I remembered the Christmas morning when I was 8, and he'd somehow managed to convince Santa to bring me the bicycle I'd wanted, the one with the racing stripes and the bell that chimed like a real fire truck. It wasn't until years later that I learned Michael had spent his entire summer's allowance on that bike. "He said to tell you that just because he can't be here in person doesn't mean he won't be part of Christmas. He's planning something special, something that'll make this Christmas unforgettable." Dad's eyes twinkled with the same mischievous gleam that Michael often had when he was plotting one of his elaborate schemes. A spark of curiosity ignited in my chest, pushing back against the sadness that had been my constant companion for weeks. "What kind of something special?" "Well, if I told you that, it wouldn't be much of a surprise, would it?" Dad ruffled my hair with his free hand, the gesture so familiar and comforting that I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. "But I will say this, your brother has been planning this for months. He's been making phone calls, sending letters, coordinating with people all over town. Whatever he's cooking up, it's going to be something to remember. The warmth of possibility began to spread through my veins like hot chocolate on a cold day. Michael had always been the master of grand gestures, the one who could turn an ordinary day into an adventure with nothing more than his imagination and infectious enthusiasm. Even when we were little, he'd had this remarkable ability to make magic happen out of thin air. I remembered the summer when I was 10 and had broken my leg falling out of the oak tree. I'd been devastated about missing the annual 4th of July festival in town, complete with the fireworks display that was the highlight of my year. But Michael had spent the entire week organizing a neighborhood festival right in our backyard. He'd convinced every family on the block to contribute something. Mrs. Patterson brought her famous apple pie, the Johnsons set up a ring toss game, and old Mr. Kowalski had somehow acquired a small cache of fireworks that lit up our little world with color and wonder. That night, lying on a blanket in the grass with my cast propped up on pillows, I'd felt like the luckiest kid in the world. "When will I find out what it is?" I asked, hope creeping into my voice for the first time in weeks. "Christmas Eve," Dad said with a smile that told me he was enjoying being part of the conspiracy. "Michael made me promise not to say another word about it until then, but trust me, son, it's going to be worth the wait." The sound of Mom's voice calling from the kitchen broke through our conversation, carrying with it the mouth-watering aroma of fresh-baked cookies. "David, Tommy, come help me with these sugar cookies before they burn." We exchanged a look, and Dad gestured toward the kitchen with his coffee cup. "Duty calls. Your mother's been baking since 6 this morning, determined to make enough cookies to feed half the county." As we walked through the house, I couldn't help but notice all the Christmas preparations that had been going on around me. The living room had been transformed into a winter wonderland, with garland draped along the mantelpiece and twinkling lights casting a warm glow over everything. The Christmas tree stood in its traditional corner by the window, a 7-foot Fraser fir that Dad and I had selected together from Hendricks Tree Farm just outside town. Its branches were heavy with ornaments collected over years of family Christmases, some handmade, some store-bought, each one carrying its own story and memory. But even surrounded by all this festive beauty, I couldn't shake the feeling that something essential was missing. Every ornament I looked at seemed to remind me of Michael. There was the popsicle stick star he'd made in 2nd grade, still hanging prominently near the top of the tree despite its crooked appearance and faded glitter. The ceramic angel that had been his contribution to our collection when he was 12, purchased with his own money from the church holiday bazaar. Even the string of lights seemed dimmer without his presence, as if they too were mourning his absence. The kitchen was a symphony of Christmas scents: vanilla, cinnamon, nutmeg, and brown butter all mingling together in a fragrant cloud that made my mouth water despite my melancholy mood. Mom stood at the counter, her apron dusted with flour, carefully transferring cookies from baking sheet to cooling rack with a spatula that had seen decades of holiday service. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and there was a smudge of powdered sugar on her cheek that somehow made her look younger and more carefree than she had in weeks. "Perfect timing," she said without looking up, but I could hear the smile in her voice. "I need someone to test these cookies and make sure they're not too sweet." It was a family tradition that went back to my earliest memories. Mom always claimed she needed official taste testers for her Christmas cookies, though I suspected it was really just her way of making sure we felt included in the baking process. Michael had always taken his role as chief taste tester very seriously, approaching each cookie with the solemnity of a wine connoisseur evaluating a vintage bottle. I picked up a still warm sugar cookie, its edges golden brown and its surface dusted with sparkling crystals of sugar that caught the light from the overhead fixture. The first bite transported me instantly to every Christmas morning of my childhood, the perfect balance of sweet and buttery, with just a hint of vanilla that lingered on my tongue. But even this perfect taste of Christmas tradition felt incomplete without Michael here to share it. "They're perfect, Mom," I said, and meant it, even though my voice came out quieter than usual. She turned to look at me then, her green eyes soft with understanding. Mom had always been able to read my moods like an open book, sensing my feelings even when I tried to hide them. She wiped her hands on her apron and reached out to cup my face gently, her thumbs brushing away the melancholy that must have been written clearly across my features. "I know, sweetheart," she said softly. "I miss him too, more than I can put into words." The simple acknowledgement of our shared sadness was like a pressure valve being released. I hadn't realized how much I'd needed someone to say it out loud, to confirm that I wasn't being silly or dramatic for feeling so lost without my brother here. "It doesn't feel like Christmas without him," I admitted, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I keep expecting to hear his laugh from upstairs or to see him sneaking cookies when he thinks nobody's looking. Everything feels wrong." Mom pulled me into a hug that smelled like flour and vanilla and all the comfort of home. Her arms were strong and warm around me, and for a moment I let myself be small again, let myself be the little boy who could be comforted by his mother's embrace. "You know what I think," she said into my hair. "I think Michael would be pretty disappointed if we let missing him stop us from enjoying Christmas. Remember what he always says about Christmas magic." I did remember. It was Michael's favorite philosophy, something he'd developed during his teenage years when he'd started to outgrow some of the simple pleasures of childhood, but wasn't ready to give up the wonder entirely. "Christmas magic isn't about getting presents or seeing Santa," I recited, hearing his voice in my memory. "It's about making other people happy and spreading joy wherever you can." "Exactly," Mom said, pulling back to look at me with eyes that sparkled with unshed tears. "And just because he can't be here in person doesn't mean we can't make him proud by creating our own Christmas magic." Dad cleared his throat from the doorway, where he'd been listening with a soft smile on his face. "Speaking of Christmas magic," he said, "I think it's time we started on some of those traditions your brother always insisted on. The neighborhood Christmas lights tour isn't going to happen by itself." The annual Christmas lights tour was indeed one of Michael's inventions, something he'd started when I was about 8 years old. Every December 23rd, we would pile into Dad's old pickup truck and drive slowly through every neighborhood in town, rating the Christmas light displays and choosing our favorites. Michael had turned it into an elaborate competition, complete with scorecards and categories like most creative use of inflatable decorations and best integration of music with lights. What had started as a simple family drive had evolved into a cherished tradition that marked the official beginning of our Christmas celebration. "Can we really do it without him?" I asked, uncertainty creeping into my voice. It seemed wrong somehow, like we'd be betraying his memory by continuing the tradition without its creator. "Are you kidding?" Dad laughed, the sound rich and warm in the cozy kitchen. "Michael would probably haunt us if we skipped the Christmas lights tour. Besides, someone needs to carry on the family tradition of arguing about whether synchronized lights to music are tacky or brilliant." The memory of last year's heated debate about the Johnson family's elaborate display made me smile despite myself. Michael had been firmly in the brilliant camp, while Dad had maintained that Christmas lights should be appreciated in peaceful silence, not choreographed to Mariah Carey songs. They'd argued about it good-naturedly all the way home, with Mom and me laughing until our sides hurt. "Okay," I said, feeling a small spark of excitement kindle in my chest. "But I get to hold the scorecards." "Deal," Dad said, extending his hand for a formal shake. "But I get to drive, and I'm not stopping at every house just because they have one string of lights around their mailbox." Mom laughed, a sound like silver bells that filled the kitchen with warmth. "You two are impossible. How about we focus on finishing these cookies first, and then we can argue about Christmas light judging criteria." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of domestic Christmas preparation that felt almost normal despite Michael's absence. We finished the sugar cookies and started on a batch of chocolate chip cookies that were Dad's favorites. I helped Mom prepare the dough while Dad strung lights along the front porch railing, occasionally calling through the window for our opinions on placement and spacing. As evening approached, the sky outside darkened to a deep purple that made the snow-covered landscape look like something from a fairy tale. The streetlights came on one by one, casting pools of golden light that reflected off the fresh snow in patterns that reminded me of scattered coins. The air had that particular crisp quality that only came with the first real snowfall of winter, clean and sharp, and full of possibilities. After dinner, we bundled up in our warmest coats and climbed into Dad's pickup truck for the annual Christmas lights tour. The truck's heater had been working sporadically all winter, so we brought along thermal blankets and thermoses of hot chocolate to keep warm during our adventure. The familiar smell of the truck's interior, a mixture of sawdust, coffee, and the pine air freshener that hung from the rearview mirror, was comforting and nostalgic. Dad started the engine, and the radio crackled to life with a classic Christmas song that immediately filled the cab with festive atmosphere. "I'll Be Home for Christmas" drifted from the speakers, and for a moment the irony of the song choice hung heavy in the air. But then Mom began humming along, and Dad tapped his fingers against the steering wheel in rhythm, and gradually the music became a source of comfort rather than sadness. Our first stop was Maple Street, where the Peterson family had created what could only be described as a winter wonderland of lights. Their entire yard was transformed into a glittering landscape of reindeer, candy canes, and twinkling trees that seemed to pulse with their own inner life. The display was synchronized to music that played from speakers hidden among the decorations, creating a show that drew spectators from all over town. "Okay," I said, pulling out the scorecard that Michael had designed years ago. "Let's see how they score this year. Creativity." "Definitely a 9, Mom said, leaning forward between the front seats to get a better view. "They've added those new icicle lights that look like they're actually dripping." "I'll give them an 8 on creativity," Dad countered. "It's impressive, but it's very similar to what they did last year. Innovation points have to be earned." We spent several minutes debating the finer points of the display, just as we had every year with Michael moderating the discussion. I found myself taking on his role as mediator, trying to balance Mom's generous scoring with Dad's more critical eye. It felt strange at first, stepping into my brother's shoes, but gradually it began to feel like a way of keeping him with us, of continuing his presence through the tradition he'd created. House by house, we made our way through the neighborhoods, each display bringing its own unique charm and character. There was the Miller house with its elegant, understated white lights that created a sophisticated winter scene. The Rodriguez family had gone all out with a nativity scene that included live animals borrowed from a local petting zoo, complete with sheep that bleated softly in the cold night air. Mrs. Chen had created an elaborate display that told the story of the night before Christmas, with animated figures that moved through the familiar poem. With each house, I felt more of the Christmas spirit returning to my heart. The joy and creativity that people put into their displays was infectious, and I found myself getting caught up in the magic of the season despite my brother's absence. The scorecard became less important than simply enjoying the artistry and effort that our neighbors had put into bringing joy to everyone who passed by. "You know what's amazing?" Mom said as we paused in front of a house where the owners had created a winter carnival complete with a Ferris wheel made entirely of lights. Every single one of these displays represents someone trying to make other people happy. Someone spent hours in the cold, stringing lights and adjusting decorations, just so that families like us could drive by and smile. It was exactly the kind of observation that Michael would have made, the kind of insight that elevated a simple pleasure into something deeper and more meaningful. I could almost hear his voice saying those exact words, could picture the thoughtful expression he would have worn as he considered the deeper significance of the Christmas light tradition. "That's the real Christmas magic, isn't it?" I said, the realization hitting me like a warm wave. "It's not about the lights themselves, it's about people caring enough to create something beautiful for others." Dad reached over and squeezed my shoulder, his eyes bright with pride in the rearview mirror. "Now you're thinking like your brother." As we continued our tour, I began to notice things I'd never paid attention to before. The way children pressed their faces against windows to get a better view of the displays. The couples walking hand in hand down sidewalks, stopping to point out their favorite decorations to each other. The families gathered in front yards, parents lifting small children onto their shoulders for a better view of the lights strung high in the trees. Each scene was a small tableau of joy and connection, people coming together to share in the wonder of the season. And suddenly, I understood what Michael had always seen in these Christmas light tour. They weren't just about judging decorations or ranking displays. They were about witnessing the ways that people chose to spread happiness in the world, about being part of a community that valued beauty and joy and shared experiences. By the time we returned home, our scorecards were filled with notes and ratings, but more importantly, our hearts were filled with renewed Christmas spirit. The sadness of Michael's absence hadn't disappeared, but it had been joined by something else, a deeper appreciation for the traditions he'd given us and the ways he'd taught us to see magic in the world around us. As we pulled into our driveway, I noticed that our own Christmas lights seemed brighter somehow, their warm glow more welcoming than it had appeared earlier in the day. Dad had done a beautiful job stringing them along the porch and around the windows, creating a display that was elegant in its simplicity. "I think we deserve some hot chocolate and leftover cookies," Mom announced as we gathered our blankets and scorecards from the truck. "And maybe we can start planning tomorrow's Christmas Eve activities." Inside the house, the warmth enveloped us like a hug, and the familiar sense of pine and cinnamon seemed even more comforting after our expedition into the cold night air. We settled in the living room, where the Christmas tree lights cast dancing shadows on the walls and the fire Dad had built earlier still glowed warmly in the fireplace. As I sipped my hot chocolate and nibbled on one of Mom's perfect sugar cookies, I felt a sense of contentment that had been missing for weeks. Michael's absence was still a hollow ache in my chest, but it was tempered now by the understanding that his influence, his traditions, and his way of seeing the world would always be a part of our family celebrations. "So," Dad said, settling into his favorite armchair with a satisfied sigh, "what's the final verdict on this year's Christmas light tour?" I looked down at the scorecards, filled with our collective observations and ratings, and realized that the numbers and rankings weren't really the point. "I think it was perfect," I said simply. "Different from other years, but perfect in its own way." Mom smiled at me from her spot on the couch, and I could see that she understood exactly what I meant. We were learning to make new traditions while honoring the old ones, to find joy in the present while cherishing memories of the past. "Michael would be proud," she said softly, and I knew she was right. Continua Historia. The next morning, December 24th, I woke to the sound of something unusual voices in the front yard, hushed but excited, punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter. The winter sunlight streaming through my bedroom curtains was bright and cheerful, casting long rectangles of gold across the hardwood floor. I could smell bacon cooking downstairs, and the rich aroma of coffee that meant Dad was already up and moving around the kitchen. But those voices outside were different from the usual neighborhood sounds. There seemed to be several people out there, and they were being deliberately quiet, as if they were trying not to wake anyone in the house. My curiosity won out over my desire to stay warm under the covers, and I padded to the window in my bare feet, the cold floor making me dance from foot to foot as I pulled back the curtain. What I saw in our front yard made me gasp in amazement. At least a dozen people were scattered across our lawn, all working together on what appeared to be an elaborate project. I recognized Mrs. Patterson from next door, along with her teenage son Jake. The Rodriguez family was there with their 3 kids, everyone carrying supplies and tools. Even old Mr. Kowalski was there, his arthritic hands carefully directing the placement of what looked like wooden panels. But what really made my heart skip a beat was seeing Mom and Dad outside too, both of them dressed in their warmest coats and looking like they'd been awake for hours. Dad was holding what appeared to be building plans, pointing to different areas of the yard and gesturing animatedly. Mom was carrying a thermos and cups, moving between the volunteers and offering what I assumed was hot coffee to keep everyone warm in the frigid morning air. I pressed my face against the cold glass, trying to understand what I was witnessing. The wooden panels that Mr. Kowalski was positioning looked like they might be the sides of some kind of structure, but I couldn't make out what they were building from my second-floor vantage point. Whatever it was clearly part of Michael's mysterious Christmas surprise that Dad had mentioned yesterday. The excitement in my chest was almost overwhelming as I threw on clothes as quickly as possible. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears as I thundered down the stairs, taking them 2 at a time in my eagerness to get outside and discover what was happening in our yard. The house was warm and filled with the scents of Christmas morning breakfast, but I barely noticed as I headed straight for the front door. "Whoa there, speedster," came a familiar voice from the kitchen doorway, and I turned to see Aunt Sarah emerging with a plate of pancakes and a knowing smile on her face. She was Mom's younger sister, and she lived about 3 hours away in Chicago. The sight of her standing in our kitchen, wearing her favorite apron over her jeans and sweater, was almost as surprising as the crowd in our front yard. "Aunt Sarah, what are you doing here? When did you get here? Do you know what's going on outside?" The questions tumbled out of me in a rush, my excitement making it impossible to speak at a normal pace. She laughed, the same musical sound that ran in our family, and set down her plate to give me a proper hug. She smelled like her signature perfume and the vanilla extract she must have been using in the kitchen, a combination that immediately made me feel safe and loved. "I drove in last night after you went to bed," she explained, her eyes twinkling with the same mischievous light I'd seen in Dad's eyes yesterday. "As for what's happening outside, well, that's all part of your brother's Christmas surprise. And before you ask, no, I can't tell you what it is. I'm sworn to secrecy." The conspiracy seemed to involve everyone I cared about, and the anticipation was almost unbearable. I could see through the kitchen window that the activity in the front yard was increasing, with more neighbors arriving to join whatever project was taking shape out there. "Can I at least go outside and watch?" I pleaded, already reaching for my coat from the hook by the door. "Actually," Aunt Sarah said with a grin, "I think you're supposed to stay inside until everything is ready. Those were very specific instructions from a certain Marine who shall remain nameless." Even from thousands of miles away, Michael was somehow orchestrating this entire event, and the thought filled me with a warmth that had nothing to do with the heated house. My brother had always been a master of surprises, but this was beyond anything he'd ever attempted before. I spent the morning in a state of barely contained excitement, trying to help with breakfast preparation while stealing glances out every window that offered a view of the front yard. The construction project, because that's what it clearly was, seemed to be progressing rapidly. More neighbors had arrived throughout the morning, including families I hadn't seen in months. The sound of hammering and sawing drifted through the windows, punctuated by friendly conversations and occasional bursts of laughter. Whatever they were building was substantial, and it was clear that this had been planned for some time. The level of coordination and the supplies that people had brought suggested weeks or even months of preparation. Around noon, Dad came inside with sawdust in his hair and a smile so wide it seemed to stretch from ear to ear. His cheeks were red from the cold, and his breath steamed in the warm kitchen air as he poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot that Aunt Sarah had kept going all morning. "How's it going out there?" I asked, trying to sound casual even though I was practically vibrating with curiosity. "Better than we hoped," he said, taking a long sip of coffee and sighing with satisfaction. "Your brother really outdid himself with the planning for this one. I've never seen the neighborhood come together like this for anything." Through the kitchen window, I could see that whatever they were building was beginning to take recognizable shape. It appeared to be some kind of small structure, possibly a shed or a booth, with walls that were being painted bright colors by a group of children under adult supervision. Mrs. Chen was directing the painting operation with the same attention to detail she brought to her own elaborate Christmas display. "Are you sure I can't help?" I asked for what must have been the 10th time that morning. "I'm good with a hammer. Michael taught me last summer when we built that tree house." Dad's expression softened at the mention of the tree house, one of Michael's projects from his last summer at home before leaving for basic training. We'd spent weeks working on it together, and Michael had been endlessly patient as he taught me how to measure twice and cut once, how to drive nails without bending them, and how to sand wood until it was smooth as silk. "I know you are, son," Dad said gently, "but this particular project requires you to be surprised. That was one of Michael's most important instructions. His little brother has to be completely surprised, or the whole thing doesn't work." The afternoon dragged by with agonizing slowness, despite Aunt Sarah's best efforts to keep me occupied with cookie decorating and card games. The sounds from outside continued, hammering, laughing, the occasional cheer when something was apparently completed successfully. At one point, I heard what sounded like musical instruments being tuned, which added a whole new dimension to my curiosity about what was being prepared in our front yard. As the winter sun began to set, casting long purple shadows across the snow-covered landscape, the activity outside seemed to reach a crescendo. There were more voices now, and I could hear the sound of people gathering, arranging themselves in what sounded like organized groups. Someone was testing a microphone, the feedback squealing briefly before being adjusted to proper levels. "Okay, sweetheart," Mom said, appearing in the living room where I'd been pretending to read the same page of a book for the past hour. "It's time." My heart leaped into my throat as I looked up at her face, glowing with excitement and something that looked suspiciously like unshed tears of joy. She was wearing her best winter coat, the navy blue one that she saved for special occasions, and her cheeks were flushed with cold and anticipation. "Time for what?" I asked, though I thought I knew the answer. "Time for Michael's Christmas surprise," she said simply, extending her hand to help me up from the couch. "But first, you need to close your eyes." The next few minutes were a blur of being gently guided through the house, out the front door, and across what I assumed was our front porch. The cold air hit my face like a physical shock, and I could hear my breath steaming even though I couldn't see it. The sounds around me were incredible, dozens of voices murmuring in anticipation, feet shuffling in the snow, the creak of winter coats as people moved around me. "Okay," Dad's voice said from somewhere to my right. "You can open your eyes now." What I saw when I opened my eyes was so unexpected, so magical, that for a moment I couldn't process what I was looking at. Our entire front yard had been transformed into what could only be described as a Christmas village. The structure I'd watched being built all day was revealed to be a beautiful little chapel, complete with stained glass windows made from colored plastic that glowed from lights inside. Around it, other smaller buildings had been arranged. A general store, a bakery, even a tiny post office, all painted in cheerful colors and decorated with miniature Christmas lights. But the buildings were only part of the magic. Our entire neighborhood seemed to be gathered in our yard, at least 50 people bundled in winter coats and scarves, all holding candles whose flames flickered in the gentle evening breeze. Children were dressed as angels, their faces shining with excitement and the glow of the candlelight. Adults held songbooks, and someone had set up a small area with musical instruments, a guitar, a violin, and what looked like a portable keyboard. In the center of it all, positioned so that it was clearly the focal point of the entire display, was a laptop computer set up on a small table draped with a white tablecloth. The screen was glowing, and I could see that it was connected to speakers that had been arranged around the yard. "Ladies and gentlemen," came a voice from the speakers, and my knees nearly buckled as I realized whose voice it was. "Thank you all for helping me create this special Christmas surprise for my little brother." Michael's voice, clear and strong despite the thousands of miles that separated us, filled our front yard and seemed to wrap around my heart like a warm embrace. Tears sprang to my eyes immediately, and I felt Mom's arm slide around my shoulders as she pulled me close to her side. "Tommy," Michael's voice continued, and I could hear the smile in his words even though I couldn't see his face. "I know you're probably wondering what all this is about. Well, remember what I always told you about Christmas magic, about how it's not about what you get, but about making other people happy." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me, and wiped away the tears that were starting to freeze on my cheeks in the cold air. This year, I realized that even though I can't be there with you physically, I could still create some Christmas magic. I could still find a way to bring our whole community together and make something beautiful happen. So I spent the last 3 months coordinating with everyone you see around you, planning this special Christmas Eve celebration. The screen flickered, and suddenly I could see Michael's face, his familiar grin beaming out at all of us from what looked like a military communications room. He was wearing his dress uniform, and he looked older somehow, more mature than when he'd left home, but his eyes still held that same warmth and mischief that had defined my childhood. "Hi, little brother," he said, speaking directly to the camera, and it felt like he was looking right at me. Miss me. The laughter that bubbled up from my chest was mixed with sobs, and I found myself laughing and crying at the same time. Around me, I could hear similar sounds from our neighbors, sniffles and chuckles and murmurs of appreciation for the elaborate surprise that Michael had orchestrated from halfway around the world. Now, Michael continued, I know you're all wondering about this little Christmas village that everyone helped build today. Well, it's not just for decoration. Each building represents a different part of our community, and tonight, we're going to use it to tell the story of Christmas in our own neighborhood. He explained that he'd written a special Christmas pageant, one that incorporated elements of our town's history and the people who made our community special. The chapel would be used for the nativity scene, but it would be populated by local families playing the traditional roles. The general store would represent the inn where there was no room, and the bakery would be where the wise men stopped to ask for directions. Mrs. Patterson, Michael said, and I saw our elderly neighbor step forward with a smile. You'll be playing the innkeeper's wife, and I understand you've prepared something special for the role. Mrs. Patterson nodded and moved to the little general store building, where she began to tell the story of Mary and Joseph's search for a place to stay. But instead of the traditional biblical setting, she transported the story to our own town, describing how the young couple had traveled from the next county over and couldn't find a room at the local bed and breakfast because of the Christmas festival. As she spoke, other neighbors joined in, each taking on roles in this modernized nativity story. The Rodriguez children played the shepherds, but instead of watching sheep in the fields, they were described as the kids who helped elderly neighbors with their Christmas shopping. The wise men were represented by the town's volunteer firefighters, who had seen an unusual bright star over our neighborhood and had come to investigate. What made it even more magical was that Michael was narrating the entire pageant from thousands of miles away, his voice weaving through the performance and connecting each element to the people and places that made our community special. He knew everyone's names, remembered their contributions to the neighborhood, and had crafted roles for each person that highlighted their unique qualities and kindnesses. When it came time for the angel to announce the birth of Christ, little Emma Rodriguez stepped forward dressed in white robes with tinfoil wings that sparkled in the candlelight. But instead of the traditional announcement to the shepherds, she delivered a message about how Christmas miracles could happen anywhere, even in small neighborhoods where people cared about each other. And the angel said unto them, Emma recited in her clear, sweet voice, Fear not, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people in this neighborhood and every neighborhood where people love one another and take care of each other. The adaptation was brilliant, maintaining the sacred elements of the Christmas story while making it immediate and relevant to our own lives. As the pageant continued, I found myself seeing our neighbors in a new light, not just as the people who lived around us, but as a community of individuals who had chosen to come together and create something beautiful for someone they cared about. When the performance concluded with everyone joining together to sing Silent Night, their voices harmonizing in the cold winter air while their candles flickered like earthbound stars, I felt a sense of Christmas magic that was deeper and more profound than anything I'd experienced before. This wasn't just about Michael's absence anymore. It was about the presence of love and community that surrounded us, even when we couldn't see it clearly. As the song ended, and people began to gather around the laptop to say hello to Michael via video call, I hung back for a moment, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what my brother had accomplished. From thousands of miles away, without being physically present, he had managed to bring together an entire community and create a Christmas celebration that none of us would ever forget. Pretty amazing, isn't it? Dad said, appearing beside me with his arm around Mom's waist. Both of them were beaming with pride and joy, their faces glowing in the light from the candles and Christmas village. How did he do all this? I asked, still struggling to process the scope of the surprise. How did he coordinate with everyone, plan the pageant, get all the supplies? Your brother started working on this in September, Mom explained, her voice thick with emotion. He's been making phone calls, sending emails, working with everyone in the neighborhood to put this together. Mrs. Patterson was his main contact here, She helped coordinate all the logistics and made sure everyone knew their parts. I looked over at Mrs. Patterson, who was currently laughing at something Michael was saying through the laptop speakers, and felt a surge of gratitude for this woman who had helped make my brother's vision a reality. In fact, looking around at all the faces gathered in our yard, I felt overwhelmed by gratitude for every single person who had contributed their time, energy, and creativity to this magical evening. Michael had taught me something profound about Christmas magic. It wasn't something that just happened to you, it was something you created for others. And sometimes, when you put that kind of love and effort into making other people happy, the magic came back to you in ways you never expected. As I finally approached the laptop to talk to my brother, the crowd parted to give me space, and suddenly I was face to face with Michael's grinning image on the screen. Even through the pixelated video connection, I could see the love and mischief in his eyes, the same expression he'd worn when he'd surprised me with that bicycle all those years ago. "So," he said, his voice clear through the speakers, "what do you think of your Christmas surprise, little brother?" For a moment, I couldn't speak. The emotions were too big, too complex to put into simple words. Finally, I managed to find my voice, though it came out rougher than I'd intended. "It's the most amazing thing anyone has ever done," I said honestly. "I can't believe you put all this together from so far away." "Well," Michael said with that familiar grin, "I had a lot of help from some pretty amazing neighbors. And besides, distance doesn't matter when you're trying to create Christmas magic. Love travels faster than light, you know." We talked for several more minutes, with neighbors occasionally jumping into the conversation to share their own messages with Michael. Everyone wanted to tell him how proud they were of him, how much they appreciated his service, and how honored they felt to be part of his Christmas surprise. It was clear that this evening had been as meaningful for them as it had been for me. As the evening wound down and people began to pack up their supplies and head home, I realized that Michael had given me something far more valuable than just a Christmas surprise. He'd shown me what it looked like to think beyond yourself, to use your creativity and energy to bring joy to others, and to understand that true Christmas magic came from the love and effort you put into making other people happy. The Christmas village would stay in our front yard through New Year's Day, Michael had announced, so that anyone in the neighborhood could enjoy it throughout the holiday season. But more than that, it would serve as a reminder of what was possible when people came together with a shared purpose and a commitment to creating something beautiful. That night, as I lay in bed looking out my window at the glowing Christmas village in our front yard, I felt more connected to Michael than I had since he'd left for his deployment. He might not have been physically present for Christmas, but his love, his creativity, and his generous spirit had been woven into every element of the evening's celebration. I understood now that Christmas magic wasn't diminished by distance or absence. If anything, it was made stronger by the effort required to bridge those gaps. Michael had reached across thousands of miles to touch our hearts and bring our community together, and in doing so, he'd created a Christmas miracle that none of us would ever forget. The longing I'd felt for my brother's presence hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had been transformed into something else. A deeper appreciation for the love that connected us, and a better understanding of how that love could manifest in the world. Michael had taught me that missing someone didn't have to mean missing out on joy, and that the best way to honor someone's absence was to carry forward the spirit of love and generosity they'd brought into your life. As sleep finally began to overtake me, I whispered a thank you into the darkness. Thank you to Michael for his incredible surprise. Thank you to our neighbors for their kindness and participation. And thank you to the Christmas magic that had shown me that love truly could travel any distance and bridge any gap. Christmas morning dawned crisp and clear, with sunlight streaming through my bedroom window and casting dancing patterns across the walls as it reflected off the icicles hanging from the eaves. The house was quiet in that special way that only happened on Christmas morning, a peaceful hush that seemed to hold all the anticipation and wonder of the holiday in its silence. But unlike previous years, when I would have bounced out of bed at the first hint of dawn, I found myself lying still for several minutes, savoring the memory of the previous evening and the warmth that still lingered in my heart from Michael's incredible surprise. The scent of cinnamon rolls drifted up from the kitchen, Mom's traditional Christmas morning breakfast that had marked the beginning of our holiday celebration for as long as I could remember. Mixed with it was the rich aroma of coffee and something else, bacon, perhaps, or the spiced ham that was always part of our Christmas feast preparation. But even these beloved familiar scents seemed enhanced somehow, made more precious by the events of the night before. When I finally made my way downstairs, still in my pajamas and wool socks, I found Mom and Dad in the kitchen, both moving with the comfortable efficiency of a long-married couple preparing a special meal together. Dad was at the stove, carefully watching what appeared to be scrambled eggs, while Mom pulled a pan of golden cinnamon rolls from the oven. Their tops glistened with melted butter and cinnamon sugar. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," Mom said, setting down the hot pan and turning to envelop me in a hug that smelled like vanilla and warmth and all the comfort of home. "How did you sleep?" "Like a baby," I admitted, surprised to realize it was true. Despite all the excitement of the evening, I'd fallen into a deep, peaceful sleep almost as soon as my head hit the pillow. I kept thinking I was going to be too excited to sleep, but I guess all that Christmas magic wore me out. Dad chuckled from his position at the stove, where he was now plating the scrambled eggs onto 3 waiting dishes. "Your brother always did know how to put on a show. I think half the neighborhood is probably still talking about last night." Through the kitchen window, I could see the Christmas village still standing in our front yard, its colorful buildings looking even more magical in the bright morning sunlight. A few early dog walkers had already stopped to admire the display, pointing and smiling as they took in the details of Michael's elaborate creation. It occurred to me that this would probably become a neighborhood legend, the story that people would tell for years to come about the Christmas when Michael organized a pageant from thousands of miles away. "Has he called this morning?" I asked, helping Mom carry plates to the dining room table, which was set with our good china and the red cloth napkins that only came out for special occasions. "About an hour ago," Dad said, joining us at the table with his coffee and a smile that told me the conversation had been a good one. "He wanted to make sure the video call worked properly last night and that everyone got home safely. I think he was more nervous about whether his surprise would work than he let on." The thought of Michael being nervous about anything was almost foreign to me. My brother had always seemed so confident, so sure of himself and his ability to make things happen exactly the way he envisioned them. But I supposed that orchestrating such an elaborate event from halfway around the world, relying entirely on other people to execute his vision, would be enough to make anyone anxious. "He also said he has one more surprise for today," Mom added, her eyes twinkling with the same conspiratorial gleam I'd been seeing from everyone involved in Michael's Christmas planning. "But this one is just for you, and it should arrive sometime this morning." The breakfast was delicious, but I found myself eating faster than usual, eager to discover what other surprises my brother might have arranged. The cinnamon rolls were perfect, with just the right balance of sweet and spice, and the eggs were fluffy and seasoned exactly how I liked them. But even these perfect flavors couldn't completely distract me from wondering what else Michael had planned. After breakfast, we moved to the living room for the traditional present opening, though this year the pile under the tree seemed smaller than usual. Mom and Dad had wrapped their gifts in the same paper they'd used for years, a classic red and green pattern with gold ribbon that never went out of style. There were a few packages addressed to me, and I could see that they'd also wrapped some gifts to send to Michael, though those would have to wait until they could be shipped overseas. I opened my presents with the usual mixture of excitement and gratitude, finding the new winter boots I'd been needing, a thick sweater that Mom had knitted herself, and a set of woodworking tools from Dad that made my heart skip with anticipation of future projects we could work on together. Each gift was thoughtful and practical, chosen with the kind of care that only comes from people who really know and love you. But as we finished cleaning up the wrapping paper and settling in to enjoy the peaceful morning, I kept thinking about Michael's mysterious additional surprise. What could he possibly have arranged that hadn't been part of the elaborate Christmas village pageant? And how could it be delivered on Christmas morning, when most businesses were closed? The answer came about an hour later, in the form of a knock at our front door that sent me hurrying to answer it before Mom or Dad could get there first. Standing on our front porch was a delivery driver I didn't recognize, holding a large, flat package wrapped in brown paper and wearing a grin that suggested he knew exactly how special this delivery was. "Tommy Morrison?" he asked, consulting a clipboard attached to the package. "That's me," I said, barely able to contain my excitement as I signed for the mysterious package. The driver handed it over with a theatrical flourish that made me suspect he'd been briefed on the importance of this particular delivery. "Merry Christmas, kid. Someone really wanted to make sure this got to you today." The package was heavier than I'd expected and rectangular, about the size of a large picture frame. I carried it carefully back to the living room, where Mom and Dad were waiting with expressions of curious anticipation that told me they were just as in the dark about this surprise as I was. "Well," Dad said, settling back in his armchair, "let's see what your brother has cooked up now." I tore away the brown paper with hands that were slightly shaking from excitement, revealing a beautiful wooden frame that looked like it had been crafted by a master craftsman. The wood was rich and dark, polished to a shine that reflected the Christmas tree lights, and the corners were joined with the kind of precise joinery that spoke of real skill and attention to detail. But it was what was inside the frame that took my breath away completely. It was a photograph, but not just any photograph. Someone had taken dozens, maybe hundreds of pictures from the previous evening's Christmas pageant and somehow created a collage that captured every moment of the magical celebration. There was Mrs. Patterson in her role as the innkeeper's wife, her face glowing with joy as she delivered her lines. The Rodriguez children were there in their shepherd costumes, and little Emma looked like a real angel with her tinfoil wings catching the candlelight. But in the center of the collage, prominently featured and beautifully arranged, were pictures of me throughout the evening. My face when I first opened my eyes to see the Christmas village, my expression during the pageant, the moment when I finally spoke to Michael through the laptop screen. Someone had been documenting the entire experience from my perspective, creating a visual story of wonder and surprise and joy. At the bottom of the collage, written in Michael's familiar handwriting on what looked like a small placard, were the words, "Christmas Magic, Tommy's first lesson in creating joy for others. Love, your big brother Michael." But that wasn't all. Attached to the back of the frame was an envelope with my name written on it in Michael's careful script. Inside was a letter, several pages long, written on the official letterhead of his military unit. "Dear Tommy," the letter began, and I could almost hear his voice in the carefully chosen words. "By the time you read this, you'll have experienced what I hope was a pretty unforgettable Christmas Eve. But I wanted to write you a letter to explain why I went to all this trouble, and what I hope you learned from the whole experience." The letter went on to describe how much he'd missed being home for Christmas, how difficult it had been to know that his family was celebrating the holiday without him. But instead of wallowing in that sadness, he decided to channel it into something positive, something that would create joy not just for me, but for our entire community. "You see, little brother," Michael had written, "I realized that the best way to deal with missing something important wasn't to focus on what I was missing, but to focus on what I could give. I couldn't be there to enjoy Christmas with you, but I could create a Christmas experience that would be meaningful for everyone involved." He explained how he'd reached out to Mrs. Patterson first, knowing that she was the kind of person who would understand his vision and be willing to help coordinate such an ambitious project. From there, the plan had grown organically, with each neighbor adding their own ideas and contributions, until it became something far bigger and more beautiful than he'd originally imagined. "But the real reason I did all this," the letter continued, "was because I wanted to teach you something important about how to handle difficult situations. When life takes you away from the people and places you love, when circumstances don't work out the way you'd hoped they would, you have a choice. You can focus on what you're missing, or you can focus on what you can create." I had to pause in my reading because my eyes were filling with tears that made the words blur together. Mom appeared beside me with a box of tissues, her own eyes bright with emotion as she waited for me to continue. Michael went on to describe how the military had taught him about service and sacrifice, but how his family had taught him about love and creativity. The Christmas village pageant, he explained, was his way of combining those lessons, using his desire to serve others with his love for his family to create something that would bring joy to everyone involved. "I know this Christmas has been hard for you," he wrote. "I know you've been sad about me not being there, and I'm sorry for that. But I hope that last night showed you that distance doesn't have to mean disconnection, and absence doesn't have to mean emptiness. Sometimes the most powerful way to be present in someone's life is to do something so unexpectedly wonderful that they feel your love every time they remember it." The final paragraph of the letter made me sob outright, the kind of crying that comes from a place deeper than sadness, a place where gratitude and love and overwhelming emotion all mix together into something that can only be expressed through tears. "You're going to face times in your life when you feel lonely or separated from the people you care about," Michael had written. "When that happens, I want you to remember this Christmas, and I want you to remember that the best way to feel connected to others is to do something that creates joy in their lives. Christmas magic isn't about receiving miracles, it's about making them happen for other people. That's the lesson I hope you'll carry with you long after this holiday is over." He signed the letter simply, "With all my love and pride, your big brother Michael. P.S. Save some room for next year's surprise. I'm already planning something even better." As I finished reading the letter aloud to Mom and Dad, the three of us sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, each lost in our own thoughts about the profound gift that Michael had given us. It wasn't just the Christmas pageant or the beautiful photo collage. It was a new understanding of what it meant to love someone and what it meant to create meaning in the world, even when circumstances weren't ideal. "You know," Dad said eventually, his voice thick with emotion, "I've always been proud of your brother for his courage and his service to his country. But I think I'm even prouder of the man he's become, the kind of person who would spend months planning something like this just to make sure his little brother had a magical Christmas." Mom nodded, wiping away tears that seemed to be equal parts sadness and joy. "He's always been special, but this is something extraordinary. To think of all the people he touched with this project, all the neighbors who came together and felt like they were part of something important." I looked again at the photograph collage, studying the faces of everyone who had participated in Michael's surprise. Each person looked genuinely happy to be there, genuinely moved by the experience of creating something beautiful together. Mrs. Patterson's face was radiant with the joy of being part of something meaningful. The Rodriguez children looked like they were having the time of their lives. Even old Mr. Kowalski, who was usually gruff and reserved, was smiling broadly in every picture where he appeared. Michael had given all of these people a gift too, the gift of being part of something larger than themselves, the opportunity to contribute their time and energy to creating joy for someone else. In a way, the entire neighborhood had been transformed by his project, brought together in a way that would probably last long after the Christmas decorations were packed away. "I want to write him back," I said suddenly, the idea forming as I spoke. "I want to tell him how much this meant to me, and I want to promise him that I'll remember what he taught me." "I think that's a wonderful idea," Mom said, squeezing my hand. "But maybe we should also think about how to pay this forward, how to use what Michael taught us to create some magic for other people." The suggestion sparked something in my chest, a warm feeling of possibility and purpose that reminded me of the excitement I'd felt while watching our neighbors work together in the front yard. Michael had shown me that Christmas magic was something you created, not something that just happened to you, and suddenly I wanted to start creating some magic of my own. We spent the rest of Christmas morning brainstorming ideas for ways to spread the kind of joy that Michael had brought to our neighborhood. Maybe we could organize a community service project, or find ways to help other military families who were separated during the holidays. Maybe we could make the Christmas village pageant an annual tradition, something that brought the neighborhood together every year. As we talked and planned, I realized that Michael's gift had done something even more profound than creating a magical Christmas memory. It had changed the way I thought about challenges and difficulties, about what it meant to miss someone and what it meant to love them. Instead of focusing on what was absent from my life, I was now thinking about what I could create to fill that space with meaning and joy. The Christmas village remained in our front yard for the rest of the holiday season, and just as Michael had predicted, it became a destination for families throughout the neighborhood and beyond. People would drive by slowly, stopping to admire the detailed buildings and to hear the story of how it had come to be. Children would ask their parents to tell them again about the soldier who had organized a Christmas pageant from thousands of miles away, and adults would shake their heads in amazement at the love and creativity that could bridge such distances. But for me, the real magic of that Christmas wasn't in the elaborate surprise or the community celebration, wonderful as those things had been. The real magic was in the lesson Michael had taught me about how to transform longing into action, how to turn missing someone into an opportunity to honor them through service to others. Years later, when I would face my own challenges and separations, I would remember that Christmas and the letter Michael had written me. I would remember that the best way to deal with absence wasn't to focus on what was missing, but to focus on what could be created. I would remember that love wasn't diminished by distance, but was actually made stronger by the effort required to express it across space and time. Michael's Christmas surprise had given me more than just a magical holiday memory. It had given me a philosophy for living, a way of approaching difficulties that focused on creation rather than loss, on service rather than self-pity, on the magic that was possible when people came together with love and shared purpose. That Christmas morning, as I sat surrounded by my family and the evidence of my brother's extraordinary love, I felt grateful not just for what I had received, but for what I had learned about what it meant to give. Michael had shown me that the greatest gifts weren't things you could wrap in paper and put under a tree. They were experiences you created for others, moments of joy and connection that would be remembered long after the wrapping paper was thrown away. The Christmas village would eventually be dismantled and stored away. The neighbors would return to their regular routines, and the magical glow of that special evening would fade into cherished memory. But the lesson would remain, carved into my heart like words etched in stone. Christmas magic wasn't about what you received, but about what you created for others. And sometimes, when you put enough love and effort into making other people happy, the magic came back to you in ways more wonderful than anything you could have imagined.